Good morning, and welcome to day 2 of the inaugural LEDx. We have some fantastic presentations for you today. I think you're really going to enjoy them. In particular, this first one is going to be outstanding. Today we have Steve Justice, who just retired in September as the Director for Integrated Systems at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. In this role, he was responsible for coordinating emerging program strategies across the Advanced Systems organization. He's a native of Nashville, Tennessee, and in 1978 he graduated from the Georgia Institute of Technology with a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering. From there, he moved on to General Dynamics Fort Worth Division, where he worked on the F-111, the F-16, and the F-16XL teams, as well as other programs. His responsibilities included aircraft conceptual design and systems engineering and integration. He joined Skunk Works in 1984, where he held roles of increasing responsibility on programs including the F-117 Nighthawk, the stealth fighter, the YF-22 stealth air superiority fighter, and his aeronautical experience worked all the way between operations analysis-based requirements through system flight test, with leadership roles leading to program manager, campaign director, and advanced programs portfolio director. Mr. Justice has 2 awarded patents and 5 classified patent disclosures. He represented Lockheed Martin on the AIAA Committee for Aircraft Design in 1990. He's the recipient of the Kelly Johnson Inventor of the Year Award in 1993 and 1999, and the Engineers Council Award for Engineering Merit and Project Achievement in 1996 and 1999. In 2005, he received the LM Aeronautics Company Aerostar Award and Corporate Nova Award for Leadership. And in 2007, he was a member of the National Academy of Sciences panel for the study of methods to reduce aircraft fuel consumption. He was one of the organization's historians and the custodian of reports and artifacts that document Skunk Work achievements. He was also an instructor for the Lockheed Martin Technical Institute for Aircraft Configuration Development, Structural Design, Systems Design, and Low Observables Technology Integration. He was the past director of the Lightspeed Youth Motivational Program sponsored by Skunk Works. In short, if you want to know anything about advanced aircraft design, this is the person to tell you about it. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Steve Justice.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's an absolute honor. We'll start with a test. You can grade yourself. It's early in the morning for a test, but tough, okay? Name different kinds of ships. And if you thought of aircraft carrier, ocean liner, rowboat, destroyer, you're an incredibly well-educated adult. Congratulations, give yourself an F. If you thought of submarine, give yourself a D. I did not ask you to name things that float on water. I asked you to name different kinds of ships. If you thought of airship, give yourself a C. It has nothing to do with water. If you thought of spaceship, give yourself a B. It's not even buoyant. And if you thought of friendship, ownership, relationship, give yourself an A. One of the greatest traps we have in the technical world as well as the leadership world is adding rules that are not there. And we do it subconsciously. The key to breakthroughs is looking where the assumptions are. In this particular case, you assumed that a ship was something that floated on water, and you eliminated a huge chunk of design space. Okay? And you did it subconsciously, without malice, without ill intent, trying to do your best job possible to get an A. So, that means other people around you are doing the exact same thing. How's that feel? I know that I failed that test. Everybody does. But once you're aware of it, now you can do something about it. I also, as I stand here and look at this group, there's a story that pops into my head about calibration in environments. A number of years ago, we hired a 2-star Air Force general. And his first day in plant, he was speaking with his boss. One of my peers walks in, delivers this general's now boss $5 worth of grief over a decision that had been made, and leaves. And the general says, "Are you going to let him talk to you like that?" Well, the answer was yes, because open communication was key, and there was no ambiguity about what was going on. About 2 or 3 weeks later, the same general was in on one of those days off. You know how when you have a day off, but you're still at work at 7 o'clock in the morning? Building PowerPoint slides, working with a junior level engineer for a presentation that was going to happen on Monday. And I passed by the cubicle and said, "Hey, how's it going?" And he looked at me and said, "I used to be a general." Thought that was a really interesting statement, because there was a calibration difference in what he saw going on, what his assumption base was for how things would operate, and he was having to completely recalibrate himself as to what a norm was. Okay, so now imagine that you have a firm set of rules and the baseline changes. How do you adapt? And that's the key. It's key to leadership, it's key to technology breakthroughs. And I believe that it is the key to what allowed the Skunk Works to be what it is. I will tell you that ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to design airplanes. My dad was on an aircraft carrier in World War II. While his job was to shoot down pesky airplanes, his gun director mount was on the flight deck level, and so he watched flight operations, and he imprinted a passion for airplanes on me. When I was in college, the first photos of the Blackbird came out. And I got a poster and put it on my wall and said, "I'm going to work there one day." And I got to do that. And that is just an absolute dream come true. The greatest privilege I had was to have the papers and documents dating all the way back to the early 1900s on the Lockheed Corporation, including a lot of the classified documents from Skunk Works programs. And I got to read, particularly Kelly Johnson's notes on his philosophies inside of programs. So I had his program logs for the U-2, the A-12 Oxcart, the YF-12, Kedlock is the code word for that, the SR-71 Senior Crown, or Blackbird, as everybody knows it, along with a variety of other programs. And you see in here an unfiltered context for him learning lessons, him finding the assumptions or the flaws in the assumptions that he had made, lamenting having taken on too much risk. When we look at this aircraft, at the very end of its cycle, after the airplane was up and flying, he said, "If we had known how hard it was going to be to do this, we probably wouldn't have tried." Think about that for a minute. We probably wouldn't have tried. And yet that means that success was out there due to the diligence that took place. And one of Kelly's rules was 1 miracle per program. And this was essentially all miracles. Every single thing. If you go back and read about the technical reports, and if somebody has questions about the Blackbird, I'd be happy to answer them in one of the breaks around. I'm pretty easy to spot, being about 6.5 feet tall, so you'll find me pretty easy up there. But you combine the idea of assumption-based rules with new environments. You've never been down this trail before. You're actually trail breaking with a really, really difficult and abstract set of problems that pound you every step of the way. Along the path, you're having to cut through thorns and thicket and all that kind of stuff that just impedes you at every step of the way. And that's what I saw in the logs. It was hard to do. And a lesson I took away from it is sometimes success is just due to pure dogged determination. I've seen everybody, when they've been given a challenge, I've never seen anybody fail when given enough time or resources to do it. Of course, that's exactly what we don't have in a lot of cases. But you can solve just about any problem that's out there. I've always seen my engineers solve problems, especially when I get out of the way and give them the opportunity to do that. One other trick that I want you to have in the back of your mind as we go through the constraints that led to the Skunk Works and form the DNA that organization has today is a concept of standing in the future and looking back, as opposed to standing in the present and looking to the future. You may say, what's the difference? When I was in college, in Air Force Magazine, there was an article. This is about 1976. Yeah, I know. That's one of the reasons all that stuff on my bio, there's so much stuff there. It's just, I've been around a long time. You'll see exactly the same thing happen through your careers. There was this, it had an article about what it was like to fly the U-2, how difficult the airplane was to fly. And I held on to that magazine. A few years ago, as I was going through and kind of culling out stuff that I could just get rid of, I found this magazine from 1976, 40 years ago. Well, what else was going on 40 years ago? And they talked about this system called GPS. And someday, if the United States really invests in electronic miniaturization, a soldier will be able to wear a backpack that weighs 15 pounds and costs $12,000 that will tell him where he is on the face of the earth. We laugh at that, don't we? Because we're standing in that person's future and looking back. Now imagine if in 1976 he said, someday, if the United States focuses on electronic miniaturization, a soldier will be able to carry something that will fit in his pocket that will tell him where he is on the face of the earth, but not only that, how to get there with voice commands, turn by turn. And it will be a camera and a personal assistant and a phone and a calendar. You would have said the guy was out of his mind. An editor never would have allowed that to even be printed. And yet that's exactly what happened. So standing in the future and looking back is a very different set of perspectives than standing in the present and looking to the future. It's very difficult to do, because what is the product of standing in the future and looking back to the people in the present? Laughter, ridicule, doubt. And what does that do to your own personal self-confidence as a leader? Can I do it? It starts ebbing away at the thought process. I look back on the Skunk Works projects that I was involved in, and in retrospect, they were extremely difficult to do. I was having so much fun at the time working for the Skunk Works designing airplanes I didn't notice. I was working with a team that was brutal to each other with their honesty. I was working with customers like you that needed capability fielded as quickly as possible. So everybody was in it together. And I think that is truly magical and results in a lot of what we now have fielded today. In 1988, I was working on something called the J program inside the Skunk Works. You know it today as the F-22 Raptor. We were working the design for the YF-22 during the demonstration validation phase. And I went over to the gentleman working the pilot vehicle interface, PVI. I said, tell me how you do your job. He said, well, I got to think of it this way. The people that are going to fly this aren't born yet. They're going to grow up with computers of a power I cannot imagine. They're going to interface with computers in a very different way than we do now. And I have to make it to where this does not seem archaic to them, that it is natural to them. I have to stand in that future and create that. And what was very interesting was everybody that I talked to had that perspective, whether it was the maintainers or the structural people, whoever it was, saying, in the time period where this is operational, this is the set of perspectives that we're going to have. How do I accommodate that in my design now? So think about trying to stand 20 or 30 years in the future and creating that future and making it happen, okay? Kelly Johnson came with a vision very early on of an organization that could respond to, we'll call it pop-up problems. It was called an experimental shop in his head, and the idea was to jam everybody together. Now, at this point in time, when he came to the Skunk Works, or to Lockheed down in Burbank, there was probably around 900 people working there. 900. And there was a communication problem. There were too much detachment between departments. Okay? How many people do we even have in this room? That was the size of the company, and there were communication problems. There was breakdowns in efficiency. And so he wanted to create this environment where everybody was pressed together and get that direct relationship that allowed the peak efficiency, rapid decision making. And he finally got his chance with the P-80. The best example I can give you of the urgency with which the United States wanted to field a jet fighter is this. My dad was in a assisted living facility, and he had a lot of friends down there. And you know, the World War II guys would all get together and tell stories. And he met this pilot, B-17 pilot, Bob Barney, shot down on his 18th mission, which was headed to Berlin. And so Mr. Barney wrote a small book for his family. My dad got a copy of it for me, and I read it. And it blew me away with what his life was like, from the Great Depression up through the war and his war experiences. And when I sat down and talked with him about the book, he described something to me that was very difficult for me to imagine. So they're headed into Berlin, you know, one of these multi-hundred aircraft raids. And there's 10 guys per airplane. Okay? If you haven't read Masters of the Air, do so. Brilliant book on the strategy, the physiology, the psychology, and the results of the 8th Air Force campaign in Europe. He described very clearly to me the effects of the cannon fire from the Me-109s that were raking his airplane, how it made the airplane, the stick feel in his hand, and when one of the engines got hit, what it felt like to fall out of formation and know that he was going down. He and the top turret gunner had a deal that they would be the last two out of the airplanes, and when Mr. Barney heard the top set of 50 cals stop firing, that meant that everybody was out, including his top turret gunner, and he could jump out of the aircraft. So Mr. Barney describes the yellow-nosed 109s coming in, raking the airplane, trying to hold the bailout bell while he tries to hold the airplane level enough for his crew to get out. And finally, the top turret 50 cal stopped firing, and Mr. Barney lets go of the stick and starts headed towards the bailout hatch. The aircraft immediately goes wildly out of control. The G-forces are throwing him around all inside the cockpit. He manages to work his way to the door, drops out of the airplane, falls for as far as he can because he wants to make sure he's away from that gyrating airplane. Goes under canopy and acts dead so that he won't be raked by the Luftwaffe up still circulating around. And then he described a scene to me that I've never read in any book. He said he looked up and all he saw were columns of smoke from the ground of all the aircraft that had been shot down, both bombers and fighters, marking the path back to England. And each one of those airplanes had 10 people in it. It's hard for us to imagine today the amount of sacrifice and the losses. It's just intolerable to us today. But that's what they were dealing with. And now suddenly, Germany introduces an airplane that's 150 miles per hour faster than our fastest fighter. What do you do about that? It was actually so fast coming through the formations that the electric-powered turrets couldn't pull lead on it, increase the jet survivability. So Kelly came back to his bosses at the Skunk Works saying, hey, I got a contract for 180 days to build a jet fighter. They said, congratulations, Kelly. But rules. You cannot disrupt wartime production. We're building B-17s, we're building P-38s and other things. So no people, no equipment, no facilities. Good luck. Kelly went down to the south end of the plant down here. You can actually see a runway across the top here. Oops, we got a laser. Runway across the top here where they flew the P-38s and later on P-80s out of. All of this is manufacturing space through here. Down here is the wind tunnel. Where'd you go? There you are. And so he went through and took the engine crates from the Wright Cyclone engines and the B-17s and built walls in a lean-to up against the wind tunnel. Rented a circus tent and draped over it to create a roof. That was his environment. Now, the good news for him was, at that point in time, there was over 90,000 people working in Burbank. Get lucky. 90,000, that's almost as much as in the corporation today. At one point, they were hiring as many as 4,000 people a month. So he could hide. A small group, he could hide and nobody would notice. So his team was very small. 2 or 3 dozen people to go do this jet fighter. So he had tremendous constraints on himself. He had to not interrupt production, not interrupt the flow of equipment or anything to the wartime production needs, and yet he still had a job to get done. This is the only known photograph that we have of the tent itself in the background of this P-80 nose. It's pretty crude. And you can go read about how the Skunk Works got its name. It's an interesting little reference to an Al Cap cartoon. But this was a brutal work environment. People were packed in very, very closely, but what you saw was camaraderie build. You see that in the teams that you work with too. When you're all jammed into one room, there's a natural alignment that takes place. And that's what he got out of his people. They were ready to fly in 143 days instead of 180. Okay. Now you were designing an airplane that was going to go faster in level flight than the P-38 did in a dive. And the P-38 was hitting compressibility effects so much so that they couldn't pull out of dives and had to have special air brakes on them and stuff to deal with that. You're going to be dealing with aerodynamic forces on the airplane unlike anything you'd seen because of the dynamic pressures. You were dealing with jet fuel instead of gasoline. So how did seals and everything, hoses work? You were dealing with a jet induction system as opposed to a propeller in 143 days. Think about that. At day 85, they were still inventing. In parallel to that, they were developing the production aircraft. So the prototype was the first one out. The production aircraft was a little different. It was a little bit larger, had guns in it, had the operational equipment. It lagged the prototype airplane by 2 months so that they could take advantage of the learning on the prototype. 1/3 of the span. Kelly's rule was people didn't work on Sundays. Kelly was the last one out of the building at the end of the day and locked the door behind him. It was absolute secrecy. Nobody could be in a carpool. Couldn't tell anybody what they were doing. Interesting environment, and you see that the DNA of that even today. Kelly came up with some axioms for success. And you see it center on decision makings. Immediate decisions. A good decision today is better than a great decision next week because it allows progress. That's how we hear it today. He was not a believer in huge amounts of overtime, although he noted in his log one time when he would come in on Monday, some work got done between the last time when he left and when he came in on Monday. Kelly was also a big believer in listening. If I remember this correctly, there's a little valve in your ear, in the cochlea, that when you talk, flips and knocks down the gain so that you don't deafen yourself when you talk. It takes about 30 dB out of sensitivity. So truly, you cannot hear as well when you talk. And then the last one was the mantra that still continues to today, is be quick, be quiet, and be on time. One of the challenges a boss gave me when I hired in 1984, he set this incredibly tight schedule. And I said, there's no way I can beat that. And he says, if I were to give you, instead of this 24-month schedule, a 36-month schedule, you'd miss that one too. I'd rather you miss a 24-month schedule because you'll miss it by a month or two, but you'll also miss the 36-month schedule, and we'll be out at 37 or 38 months, which is better. So we had these incredibly aggressive schedules in these environments that forced you to make decisions very quickly and concentrate on what was important. Some other rules started to pop out as well and resulted in what we called Kelly's DNA for the Skunk Works. And you can see a summary of those listed on the left-hand side. And the first one is a one strong, knowledgeable leader. I'll show you some examples of that with Kelly here in just a second. But you can look down through that list and you can see the roots of stuff that he learned on the P-80. There was actually a P-80 set of experimental shop rules that evolved into this set that he had. And we try to abide by these today. Not always successful, but we try to abide by these today. I got to remember I'm retired now and don't speak for them. The problem with all this is we try to do this. The principle is simple. It's all duh. There's nothing new here. But I want you to think about the number of times you've not done duh. You've not done what's obvious. You've made life harder for yourself because you haven't followed simple principles. And so in reality, it's very difficult to implement, and it takes commitment over a long period of time. In World War II, a lot of airplane companies could build airplanes in 6 months. But one of the things that was different between the Skunk Works and those other airplane companies was Kelly stayed in charge of the Skunk Works for about 30 years. So the expectations were constant. Ben Rich, his handpicked successor, carried it into about 1990. So there was about, from 1943 to about 1990, about 50 years of continuous expectations, of constant expectations. Whereas most jobs, leaders change out about every 2 years because they're promoted. So this holding these expectations over time was absolutely critical and a very big differentiator for the Skunk Works. Looking at Kelly's rule number 1, these are pages out of his Archangel log. And we'll start off with the technical log, and you can see his notes on the front here. And on about 7 pages, he sizes a Mach 3 airplane. Works up all the skin friction drags, the propulsion parameters, the weights of the aircraft, and determines a final performance. On 8 pages, he plans the program. And so you'll see in here as he works up through labor costs, material costs, headcount over time, for both the shop as well as engineering, production rates of aircraft. You'll also see in here there's aircraft deliveries, estimated unit cost of aircraft, and then the all-important pilot bonus in there. Make sure you don't miss that. Okay? Look at how rounded this one individual was. It allowed him to ask questions in any domain. Specialization is great. It's fantastic. But look at what having a broad aperture brings to you. The ability to ask questions in any domain. And that's what was expected of me in a leadership role at the Skunk Works. The ability to ask questions anywhere. It wasn't my job to do this stuff anymore, sadly, because I really enjoyed my time in the trenches, the hands-on designing of airplanes. But when I lifted up out of that, my job was to ask questions, very hard questions. Questions that other people may not be asking themselves because they have defined a ship to be something that floats on water. They become very task-focused. You saw one example in Todd's briefing yesterday about the card game or the magic trick. You know, another example of this is in an exercise where they ask people to look around a room and find everything that's blue. You got 10 seconds, make a list. Have people close their eyes in and name things that were in the room that were brown. They can't name anything because they become so task-focused that they miss all the other stuff going on. And a leader's job is to step back and ask those questions not only within a domain, but cross-domain. How does a technical decision impact the program plan? And how can you do that if you don't have an understanding of how all those different pieces work? His unwritten rules. This is what I got from talking with people that worked for him, including customers. I gave you the example of extremely compressed schedules. I will tell you there was one time the customer, the Air Force, asked for a first flight in 24 months. My chief engineer came up to me with a schedule that was 32 months. It's like, well, you, the evaluators, wouldn't even look at that because it wasn't compliant to the RFP. Because, but this is what it takes, Steve. And I go, to what rules? Well, we have to do this, we have to do this. And wait, we have to do what? There was one case, it had a kind of a strange nozzle on the backside, kind of like an F-117 nozzle, you know, which is hard to call a nozzle sometimes when you look at its efficiencies, but they had to do this tremendous amount of wind tunnel work and computational fluid dynamics on it. And I asked why they did some of these analyses in here, because the labor hours were just killing us, and it was killing the schedule as well. And so because we always do this. Excuse me? Well, this is CFD runs. These tasks are things we always do. And I said, let me ask you a question. If the back end of this airplane was round and came to a round nozzle in the back, there was a vertical tail above it, horizontal tail mounted out of the fuselage, how much CFD would you have to do on this thing. And the guy started calculating in his head, well, we'd have to do this. And then he stopped, and he said, none. I go, right answer. Because there's a P80 on a pole right out front that they didn't do any CFD on, okay? Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And that's one of the hardest things, because you become so entrenched in how things are done, down to the process itself. You become locked in. And you become trapped by that, a ship is, even in how things are done. Fixed price programs. This was a really interesting one. The CIA had a fixed price program for the development of the ox cart. The Air Force rolls in with the Senior Crown or the Blackbird program for the SR-71 and wanted to transition from a fixed price contract to a cost plus program. And Kelly notes in there, this is just an excuse to overrun. He wanted no flexible boundaries out there at all. Now, we all know the flaws of that today, but isn't that an interesting philosophy? Don't allow me the flexibility to overrun. Force me to make hard decisions about what it is I do and don't do. It forces me to determine what is truly important to do, as opposed to doing the stuff I normally do. Only invent what is required. This is the one that broke Kelly's fundamental rule of one miracle per program, the SR-71. That just trashed that one. But one of the things you see on the P-80, for instance, they used a British engine, so that was off the shelf. You see parts from other airplanes stuffed in it all over the place. What was unique to it was the sheet metal of the outside and a few of the components on the inside. But they used pieces off of a P-38, off of a P-51. They used whatever they could, because you want to save invention for the things that really count, the things that are associated with the breakthrough itself. On the Blackbird, when you have something that's, I was talking to some people last night, when the cooling temperatures in the nacelle are 800 degrees Fahrenheit, there's not a lot of parts on the shelf you can go pull to do that. When you're designing a stealth airplane for the first time, not a lot of stuff you can pull off the shelf. And I think that's the kind of thing that resulted in Kelly saying if we'd known how hard it was going to be, we probably wouldn't have tried. Thank goodness they did, because what an incredible masterpiece that airplane was. Absolutely, so just a work of art. I got to experience the takeoff of a Blackbird one, stand by the nozzle when it was running in full afterburner, or standing by the wingtip when it was running in full afterburner, and you couldn't clench your jaw tight enough to keep your teeth from rattling. I mean, that is just power. You see that 40-foot long flame coming out the back. Standing on the out near the runway when it took off was just a visual imagery that I will never ever forget. So thank God they went through and followed through on that, and also the decision-making power that it gave 7 presidents to make really hard decisions using that information. Thoroughly documented work. The reports they wrote on these compressed schedules are stunning. They're not PowerPoint. They are written prose with tables inserted. All done by hand, typed, no Microsoft Word. There's one report that documents a surprise they found in flight test on the Blackbird that's this thick. And they did that while on a program where they invented everything from go-ahead to first flight in 32 months. They were writing reports. Look how lazy we are today. And I will tell you, some people go, well, I document everything in PowerPoint. I dare you to go brief with the same fidelity a PowerPoint presentation you created a year ago. After so many years, it'll mean absolutely nothing. You'll just have what exists in imagery on the slide. And if you have the same admonition that most people have, which is a slide is intended to be briefed, it is not a self-contained piece of information, you can see the even further detachment there. What was beautiful about having all of these documents that they wrote, when we went to work the Rattler's Mach 3 cruise missile, there was a whole series of wind tunnel tests we didn't have to do, because the guys had data right there explaining what it was and how stuff worked. Saved everybody money in the development phase. Here's a page out of the XP-80 log. This will be the production, XP-80A production bird. You can see the days are numbered on the left with a date beside it. And on day 86, you can kind of read this, I'll read it to you. Day 89. We roll down through here. CLJ, let me see if I can tag this for you. I'm reading from right about, the little laser has died. CLJ has okayed C.D. Stewart to work over here, had a long talk with him and let him know exactly what is expected of him. He is enthusiastic. Fuel system to meet Cooper's requirements is not yet invented. Bradley and others trying to get a good idea. We need a valve which will pass fuel but stop air. Kelly was working the prototype of the airplane that was 2 months ahead, but would come in once a week and check the log to see how things were going. Now imagine writing down for your boss to come in and see that you didn't know how to do something on day 89. Well, look what it results in. Hey, I know how. CLJ. It resulted in the problem being solved. What we would see as a vulnerability resulted in moving the ball down the field. So think about now today how willing you are to expose the flaws that you have in your decision making, your shortfalls, when it could be the key to how you move forward and get out of that rut that you're in. I think it also shows tremendous leadership, because Kelly came in and talked to somebody and said, here's what I expect of you. So Kelly had his rules for the shop, and he would also sit down with people defining the expectations that he had for everyone on the program. How often do you see that today? If you're a member of my lab this afternoon, you'll see my rules. You'll see my expectations of leaders, and you'll see how my brain works. You're welcome to have a copy of it. If you're not in the lab, you can contact the people that run this thing. They have a PDF of it or a scan of it. But I sit down with every new team that I have and explain exactly how my brain works, as well as what my expectations of my leaders are. So there is no ambiguity whatsoever, and that's what Kelly did, and I thought that was a really good idea. Kelly Johnson, the man, you can read those up there. I will go down about halfway. Called them as he saw them. He accepted his perspectives being challenged but seldom lost, and yet people would still go in and challenge him. Imagine somebody that's got a batting average of 900, and you're going to challenge him. Hard thing to do, but that's the level of trust that Kelly had on his team. You'll also notice that he had the right people in the right job. You heard that mantra yesterday. If they weren't the right people in the right job, changes were made. Ineffective people were removed quickly, because that was just burning budget otherwise. And you see rigid staffing control. People didn't get to hang around once their job was done. All the keys to schedule and budget management while getting the technical job done. When you would talk to members of his team, I think the last one that I know of just recently passed away last year. You saw violent loyalty to the man, even though he was hard on him. Absolute violent loyalty. Nobody dared say a bad thing about Kelly. And I believe that's what we should expect from today's leaders. Violent loyalty. So the role of leadership is to create the environment and find those people that can fit into that environment. So in creating the environment as a leader, define the end state, not the path to achieve it. One of the things I tell my wife is, you can tell me what to do or how to do, but not both. Give me some flexibility in the job here, okay? I'm always amazed. I would define this end state to my young teams, people that are just out of college. They never do it the way I would. They do it better. And I find that fascinating. I learn. Be the accountability boundary. In the vein of Eisenhower writing the letters for the D-Day invasion. He had a letter if it succeeded and a letter if it failed. If it succeeded, it was because of the sacrifices of those men that went ashore and parachuted in. If it failed, it was his fault. Excuse me. All leaders should be that way. The team should know that none of the bad stuff is going to flow down to them. And they get all the reward. Enable decision-making at all levels. Who makes what decision? Lock that down. Define it. So people know who to go to get a particular kind of decision made. Tailor the processes to meet needs. Don't just rubber stamp processes into a program. At the Skunk Works, we had the ability to tailor what was called arrow codes to a specific program need. Arrow codes were designed to handle huge production programs like the F-22 or F-35. That's not what the Skunk Works is. Skunk Works doesn't solve all problems. It solves a very narrow niche of problems. So we tailored those codes, arrow codes down to meet the specific needs of a program. And we didn't even use the same rubber stamp between small programs. And then define your style and expectations and share it. As I said earlier, that's what I did with my set of rules. I'll give you one example for those of you that aren't in the lab this afternoon. There are 5 reasons I ask a question. Number 1, I asked a question, you didn't answer it. A lot of what we see from politicians today. Number 2, I didn't understand what you said. So I'm asking more questions. Number 3, I'm educating myself. This is new to me, and I want to learn more. Number 4, I'm educating other people in the room because they won't ask questions, and I know they don't know the answers. And number 5, I'm testing your convictions because if you don't believe it, why should I? And none of those are an attack. And yet, how often are questions seen as an attack? I want to make sure you have the fortitude behind your responses, but I don't question the validity of them. Then, seeking those with the proper mindset. Assume it can be done. As soon as you try to determine whether or not something can be done, you start finding all the ways that it can't be done, all the reasons it can't be done. Apply wisdom. This is one thing that was really interesting to me. When I stepped into Bill's office yesterday, I saw 4 words up on the board that I found fascinating. Wisdom, fortitude, justice, and temperance. You guys know where that came from? It's a movie, Gladiator, Marcus Aurelius. I thought that was a really interesting set of attributes. Think about what your attributes are and apply those to your style. You see courage up there in decision making. As a leader, you're going to have to make very bold decisions, ones that are risky, ones that will risk your career. But that's your job. Your job is to be out on the tip of the spear. Have control in stressful situations. Never let a situation get to you. You got to maintain your cool, because if you lose your cool, everybody else will as well. Despise fear, but don't, or despise failure, but don't fear failing. As soon as you fear failing, you're going to make different decisions. I despise it. I want you to hate it with every fiber of your being, but don't fear it. I also, one of the things I have is I don't want people on my stressful teams that have not failed before. It is a tough thing to watch somebody fail for the first time because it's hard for them to recover. Understand the boundaries of tolerance. How far do you let something go before you have to step in? I would let my young teams go to the edge of the cliff, lean over that cliff, their toes start to slip off before I would grab them by the collar and pull them back in. Because I needed for them to learn that they were failing. If I save them too early, they don't know or don't understand the consequences of their decisions. And then find those that seek opportunity and risk and uncertainty and ambiguity and sudden change. That's what I look for in a Skunk Works team member. That's what Kelly looked for in his, even though he didn't write it down this way. Think about what your team is trying to achieve and define that set of expectations. Lastly, Kelly had this, his promise to his Skunk Works team. And I thought this was very interesting. Challenging, worthwhile job, stable employment, fair pay, a chance to advance, and contribute to our nation's first line of defense. You guys may not recognize this, but we as the contractors, when we're going to put somebody in the nose of a jet for the first time, that's our friend going in the nose. And when we design an airplane that's going to be going into combat, we want that person to come home to their family every single time. And we want the bad guys to have a bad day. We don't want a fair fight. It's not a sport. We want a crushing win. We want to hand you whatever instruments we can to give you that dominating advantage. And it is an honor to be able to do that for our nation. I never served in the military, but I saw how patriotic my dad was. And they passed that on to me, and I tried to fulfill that through the job that I did. It was an honor to do so, and it was an honor to speak to you today. Thank you so much.